Hey everyone, welcome to the Psyched Practice Podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Christner, and with me as always,
Paul Wagner. And, Ray, what an interesting episode we had today. I guess I should probably say what it was about. We had a Masters in Practice episode where we had the opportunity to interview Dr. John Gavazzi on two really interesting, and usually we don't think of these two things together, but ethics and AI.
Yeah. It was, and I think either one of those could have been a full episode in itself, but interesting kind of talking about them together and kind of looking at, maybe what the future holds with ethics and what's coming up with the world of artificial intelligence. So it was definitely an interesting conversation. So Paul, I guess I'm interested in what was your takeaway?
So John talks about this, the idea of the SHAPE model, and it was scrutinize, hypothesize, analyze, perform, and evaluate as a way that we can kind of make sure that we're making ethical decisions. And I've never really heard that acronym before, but it just feels like a really simple and functional way of checking ourselves and as best we can, making sure we're making ethically sound decisions. And he also, talks about this idea of weak AI and how, in the future, we're going to be developing this stronger AI. And just fascinating conversation that I really didn't have a knowledge base on. So, I had a hard time picking. So those were the two of many standouts for me.
Yeah, there definitely was a lot that we could have picked from. And, one of the things I appreciate with John's work in ethics is, we're not just talking about ethics codes. He really talks about this idea of decision making. And at one point, I think he uses the word decision science or decision making science. And, this idea of, what's the process we go through, identifying our personal values and morality and ethical principles and how that all kind of combines together. And so I think it was a neat way to listen and talk through some ideas about ethics. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. John Gavazzi, he is a clinical psychologist here in Pennsylvania, but has done just extensive work in the world of ethics. For those, he mentions this at the end, but he has a great website called ethicalpsychology.com. I'd encourage you to check out all the resources that he has there. And we'll talk a lot about his background there as well. And for those of you who are listening, share your ideas with us. What are your takeaways from today? Share with us on social media and be in touch.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Ethics Education and the Impact of AI on Mental Health with Dr. John Gavazzi.
John, thanks so much for joining us on the Psyched Practice podcast. Paul and I are grateful for you taking some time out of your day to join us and talk a little bit about ethics and AI.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to start off today talking a little bit about your background and just to kind of get a little backstory. So I guess, John, can you share a little bit with the audience about what led you into working in the mental health field?
Yeah, I feel like I should be on Wayne's World where you doodle-loo, back in the mists of time. So as embarrassing as this may be, I actually did my senior thesis on consciousness. And when I say senior thesis, I don't mean in college, I mean in high school. So we had to produce this, and I'm not going to belabor the point. I only got a C on it, but that didn't dissuade me from going into psychology. So I went to Penn State, got my undergraduate degree in psychology, and I had a minor in religious studies. Now, you may think that's a little bit odd, but when I was getting involved in psychology and learning more about it, I was trying to really understand what motivated people to behave in the way that they did. So I thought, religion is probably, one reason what would motivate people to behave the way they do, which again, we'll jump ahead a little bit and talk about morality. But then while I was there at Penn State, I met two professors, Dave Palermo and Jim Martin. And Jim Martin had more of a lasting impact on me because he was saying to me, why are you studying religious studies? You should be studying philosophy to understand what motivates people. So I ended up going to Duquesne, which it was at the time one of the two schools that had a existential phenomenological blend to the practice of psychology. The other one, I believe, was in St. Louis, and I didn't feel like moving there. So I went through that program. I ended up getting licensed at the master's level. So I had to take a couple extra courses over at Capitol Campus because you needed to have that at the time. And again, we're talking, late 80s. Yes, and I am old. So I'm soon to be 60 here. So I'm glad you don't have the video going and you can see how really old I look. But then I got licensed as a psychologist at the master's level. And I believe that I needed to go for my doctoral degree. I would like to have more options. So I went to Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And the reason I went there, and again, sticking with that consciousness theme, is I studied hypnosis. And after I got licensed, I did a lot more in hypnosis. And to me, the way that consciousness maps onto hypnosis is kind of that dual processing concept. So the conscious mind is doing one thing, the unconscious mind is doing something else. And so I'm thinking, wow, this really works very well with my fascination with consciousness. So I got out of graduate school then in the 1990s, late 1990s, got married. Then I had to do something practical. I couldn't sit around thinking about consciousness and hypnosis. I did practice hypnosis somewhat, but I became more of a pragmatist. So I've been a clinical psychologist ever since. I'm tying this back then into the ethics component because you would think then that with my background also in religious studies, that would have then formed my beliefs about, ethics and ethical practice. And again, no correlation there, orthogonal. So what I did was I got really into studying just plain old ethics. And so ethics is basically what our code is. How are we supposed to practice psychology? And I got really good at that. I got really good at understanding what the rules and the regulations were. So maybe I should have been a law student, because that's more like what the ethics code is. And I did lots of presentations with many other PPA members, and that stands for Pennsylvania Psychological Association, for those of your listeners who don't know, and did that very well. But the one thing that seemed to be missing was that kind of personal value component to our ethics code. And so Dr. Sam Knapp, who has written extensively on this, he really started talking about blending personal values with your professional obligations. And to me, that really made sense because, as we're probably going to talk about in a little bit about ethical decision making, that's really what you want to do as a professional. You want to make sure that you understand what your own personal values are so that you can blend them with your professional obligations so you can make an ethical decision that's right for you. So where that then led me, and I feel like I'm talking way too much because you guys aren't asking any questions, is that I read John Haidt, and I can't remember the name of his book. It'll come to me. But he talked more about morality and the research that he was doing with morality and moral belief systems. And so there was and still are a whole cadre of social psychologists who are studying morality. And so to me, looking at one theory is moral foundations theory. Another one is Schwartz's value theory. But the idea then is that people are actually studying how does morality then drive behavior? Because there is a ton of research out there that shows how morality drives behavior. So that's always interesting to me as a clinical psychologist. But then as an ethics educator, that's the morality component. That's where you can help psychologists and other mental health workers really look at their own values. Now we have a framework. We just can't say morality and then leave it to religion. So it's like morality. And well, what do we mean by that? And well, we can explore that more, as I said, with moral foundations theory or Schwartz's value theory, and then have psychologists then kind of work with those different domains. There are some self-reflection tools. You can look at these online. Yourmorals.org is one of them, where you can take some of these tests and you can look at your moral values. So when I do some, depending on what ethics training I'm doing, I'll have people do that and go out onto the website, and you can do it literally in real time. And so then, you can then get feedback and help people understand kind of where they lean in terms of their own moral values. And I think that's a huge benefit for psychologists, because a lot of times we don't reflect on our morality, and our morality is something fundamentally different than our religion in most cases. In some other cases that, it's like the old Venn diagram. For some people, their religion and their morality overlap completely. And for others, they're barely over, they're not touching. And for some people, they don't have a religion. So again, it would be, looking at their own moral value system. So that's kind of how I got to be not only a clinical psychologist, but how I got to be an ethics educator all at the same time.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like you kind of that I think you mentioned the idea of studying morality even before you were a psychologist. That was part of your master's program at Duquesne. And then it seems like that then came back later on and really has blended well with your ethics work.
Well, that's correct. So I went from the religious studies, and then I had to have somebody tell me, well, that you're looking in the wrong, right idea, wrong place. And then I started looking in the right place, and that really wasn't the right place in terms of philosophy. And then again, thankfully, the social psychologists studying morality are the people doing the hard work these days.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting blend, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about ethics, people see it as this very bland, here are some rules that we have to follow and not make mistakes, and really don't look at what is that personal piece that we have to deal with in making those decisions. And sometimes they don't always, match up, what we think should happen. So I think it's an interesting twist and something that takes the idea, and we will talk about the whole idea of decision making, but by looking at our own, personal values, how that really influences our decision-making process. This isn't about just checking off that we got CEs in ethics education. It's really about this process of how we understand ethics and our own decisions.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And I even hear, like, going back to your high school thesis of, consciousness there, and you dividing up that conscious versus unconscious element, and hearing how morality can fall kind of in the gap there. And it can be maybe an unconscious feature that drives our conscious thoughts and actions. And so even back then, like, I hear that there was maybe some tethers there that, not until years later, really kind of coming in and having a more solid foundation of what that is. But your comment of blending personal values with professional obligations, like, one of the questions I was hoping to explore, and I'd still like to explore a little bit more, but is this idea, like, what's a compass that clinicians can use when practicing? And really that feels like a pretty good starting point for that for clinicians. So, what are my personal values, and how is that, how am I blending that here with, what I have to do or what my role is professionally? Is that how you see it, John?
Well, in some ways, yes. So I'm going to stray from the consciousness piece first, and then I'm going to come back to it. But there's a classic article by Handelsman, Gottlieb, Knapp, and Young, and it's called The Acculturation Model, something like that. And it's about the how people develop in terms of a profession. So it comes up with a nice little 2x2 design. And so on one side, it's, professional obligations, and the other side, it's personal values. And then are you putting the emphasis on both professional obligations and personal values? Then you're like an integrated psychologist, and way to go. You're practicing really, really well. So that would be a good kind of compass idea. But then if you're low on professional obligations and low on personal values, in other words, kind of like you're a sociopath, those are the people who end up in front of licensing boards. Right. So again, that's that kind of unique blend. And that's what makes, I think, that model, that acculturation model, so powerful for clinicians to think about. Now, going back to that kind of conscious unconscious divide, is that right? Unless we're aware of what our values are, we're not going to be able to have an integrated sense of self. We're not going to be able to make those kind of integrated decisions, because either our professional values will win out. And sometimes we can be overly robotic if that's all we're doing, and overly legalistic, like, oh, I'm sorry, here are the rules. I cannot go to your birthday party. MEPS, that's unacceptable. As opposed to then more of my personal values take over. Oh, well, hey, I'm really trying to be a good guy. So yeah, here, I'm going to write you a check. You can't make your rent. I'm going to write you a check for $400. You can just pay me back. In both of those cases, that's not kind of the quintessential integrated psychologist. You're either putting your own values ahead of what's best for the patient, or you're putting the rules and obligations of the profession over what's in the best interest of your patient.
So, John, kind of talking just a little bit more about kind of your background. So, with kind of all these kind of diverse interests, I guess I'm curious, like, who are some of the people, like you mentioned a couple of professors in your master's program that kind of led you in that direction. Who are some other people that kind of inspired you to kind of move into this idea of ethics and in your profession as a psychologist? Well,
we can again take the larger issues, like some of the philosophers out there, Foucault, Sartre. Those are these big names that people hear about, and they did have an important impact on my own development. But I think in terms of psychology itself, and again, this is where I talk a lot about this to my patients, about feeling a sense of gratefulness, gratitude, because sometimes luck is on your side. What's that from the Hunger Games? May the odds be ever in your favor.
Yes.
Right.
So the graduate school that I went to, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, the chair of the department was Lee Vandekreek. And for those people who don't know who Lee Vandekreek is, he has written extensively about ethics and ethics education. Yeah. Now, again, I did not go to IUP to learn about ethics, but it just so happened that he was there. So he actually had a fairly significant influence. As I already mentioned, Sam Knapp. I have done many presentations with him. I've written many articles with him. And there are other, again, PPA members like Rick Small, Don McAleer, that I've done numerous presentations with over the years. And I think it's really important to be able to collaborate with other people. So those are the people that I have collaborated. Sam, Rick, Don, those are the people that I've really collaborated with the most. Now, there's a bunch of other people on the ethics committee that I have collaborated with as well.
Yeah, I think, for those of us in Pennsylvania, I don't know how if all of us realize how lucky we are that two of the leading people in the field of psychology and ethics, with Sam Knapp and Lee Vandekreek, how big they are in the field and how much they've offered here in the state of Pennsylvania and nationally. It's great resources to have. So Joel, let's kind of move into talking a little bit about the idea of ethics and moving into kind of a little bit more details with it. One of the things that I hear from kind of I guess younger professionals is this idea of trying to understand the difference between legal concerns and ethical concerns. At what point, what's the difference, and at what point do they kind of come together and are similar, and at what point do they diverge?
Well, I think the kind of the classic teaching of ethics, which I don't really do too much of, but again, I can get my credits by teaching and I can get my credits by going to see other people. And yes, sometimes I go see other people who are not PPA members. And typically that's what they do. They usually say, okay, well, here are the clinical issues, here are the legal issues, and then here are the ethical issues. And they try to like keep those containers or those domains separate, and then they kind of mush them together. So when I talk to people about legal ethics or legal issues, I usually talk about them more in terms of risk management or risk mitigation. So many of the laws that we have out there are really, black letter law. It's like it's really hard to not interpret it as such. So, and those make for really boring ethical dilemmas too. I mean, that's really, should I follow the law or should I break the law? I mean, that's your dilemma. And I encourage everybody listening, follow the law. Follow the law. That'll mitigate your risk every time. But, again, simple things like, don't have sex with your patients. I mean, that's okay. I get that.
Pretty clear cut.
Yeah.
Right?
Don't defraud insurance companies. Check. Got that. Don't manufacture documentation. Okay. Check. Got that. So you're trying to do, and follow the law, as best as you can. So I think that, again, to not break the law and to make sure that you're following the law, you really need to read the ethics code and whatever state you're in. So, read your state ethics code. Then you also need to read the APA ethics code. And then you need to read the APA guidelines for best practices, because that will give you all of the best practices and what are the guardrails to me doing what I'm doing. Now, then you get into some issues that are legally gray. I guess that would probably be the best way of saying it. So issues about, when you have multiple relationships with your patients. So, again, kind of the old school dilemma that I was taught on. I don't use this anymore, but if you bump into your patient at the grocery store, do you say hi to them? Because again, you have you're seeing them out of the office and, do I acknowledge them? And when I was very young in practice, I would go over that because I had heard it. And I was like, oh, and how many people have I seen in the grocery store over the years? Like maybe 4, and I've been practicing 30 years. So it's happened 4 times. But I think then that's what you have to do though, is think about, again, going back to that acculturation model. And what are your own personal values? And what is it that you are trying to accomplish in the therapeutic relationship? So you might want to keep in mind then those underlying ethical principles that we have, which are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, fidelity, and justice. And for the people out there who are listening, no, I'm not reading that off a piece of paper. These gentlemen can attest to that. I've just done. So autonomy is
from your memory.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you do it for 20 years and then kind of stick some of it. So autonomy is that you give the person the ability to make their own decisions. And here in the United States, we hold autonomy as like the highest ethical principle. The second is beneficence. You're going to do well by your patient. Psychotherapy, psychology is at its core a beneficent profession. Non-maleficence is above all, do no harm. Fidelity is that you're trustworthy, that what you say you're going to do. And then the last one is justice, which is you treat everybody as fairly as possible. So going back then, so if you have an ambiguous legal issue, number one, you should have a group of people you can consult with and bounce that off of. So say, okay, what do y'all think of this? Or make sure that somebody who's an attorney who is schooled in psychology law, so you can call them on the phone and say, hey, I'm really kind of struggling with this. What do you think? So those are 2 of your options. But it really comes down to, and I've been using this recently, based on some of the decision science that I've been reading over the years. But really ethics, a lot of it comes down to, am I doing something for my best interest or am I doing something for my patient's best interest? And that's when thinking about it legally, I mean, this usually works most of the time, although, legally you're trying to manage your own risk and you're trying to protect yourself. But I think even in those kinds of situations, if you're doing what's in your patient's best interest and you're following the ethical principles and you can document that in a way that explains what you're doing, you're in much better shape than if you just say, well, that's what the law says, sorry, or I'm just going to do this even though this is what the law says. But if you have some reasonable approach to that, and we can again get into how you go about doing that, but if you have some reasonable approach that you can document, then you're in much better shape. And I encourage everybody, whenever you have a significant stomach churning ethical dilemma, you consult with people and you write it down. So the more you document, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
And John, one of the things, I kind of know about you just from, past interactions is that you do some work for licensing boards and reviewing cases. And so I guess I'm curious, I know the legal cases, those might seem kind of, I think, simple for people. Like you said, you don't have sex with patients. We don't do insurance fraud. What are some of the more common ethical dilemmas that you see or that you think are kind of common that happen that really are more gray areas for people that really they do have to do a much deeper dive into the decision-making process?
Well, I'm going to answer that kind of in what I testify against or what I see and people are able to get a resolution to. So again, the people who don't seek a resolution are people who've gone kind of way over the line. And again, this is what we're talking about, insurance fraud, or they have treated multiple patients poorly. So those people have had boundary violations with multiple patients and multiple patients are complaining. So the ones that are more that I've seen, and again, some of the research backs this up, is in terms of boundary violations. So in terms of when does that therapeutic frame break down into something else? So one of the things that we all need to be aware of is in that professional relationship, it is not a friendship. And when you start looking in that relationship to having your own needs met, and I'm not necessarily saying sexual needs, but your own emotional needs or your own friendship needs or your own financial needs in some situations, then that's when you're going to get into trouble. But as long as you don't go too deep, then you can rebound. I mean, you can probably settle something with your state board without, and again, you're going to get censored. You'll have a black mark on your license, but it's not that they're going to suspend you from practice, or revoke you from practice. But a lot of these, what I see, are just really boundary violations.
And along with that, John, I wonder how much of, ethical dilemmas when you are reviewing cases for licensing board come from a lack of knowledge base. So kind of going back to that, those professional obligation pieces with the onset of telehealth and, since COVID, it's really been a more prominent piece. Some of that has rapidly changed. And so I'm thinking of, where clinicians are taking their clients. Are they making sure that they're practicing within their home state, or are they making sure that, they're maintaining confidentiality? So some of those pieces where we might see that boundary crossing, not necessarily from the clinician action, but rather from the lack of awareness of how they're conducting themselves or where they're conducting themselves. Do you see that as a potential ethical violation?
Well, again, I don't think it's a dilemma. I think that's the root cause of the infraction or the transgression. So, right. So people who don't know, who've been poorly trained, and again, going back to that 2x2 model, that they're low on professional obligations because, I read this when I was in graduate school. I haven't looked at it since. And the State Board of Psychology said I had to take 3 credits in ethics. I just kind of blew that off. I haven't been audited, and I'm working in private practice, and I'm not getting feedback on any of this. So yes, that is one of the drivers. A lack of awareness. I think when people get deeper into it, I think it's more the emotional needs that the psychologist is trying to take care of, whether it's, some deep-seated psychological need that they're not aware of and they keep replicating, or is it, some kind of boundary crossing that they keep replicating? So I see a lot of, we could just kind of use the just general label, like emotional needs not being met. And they're using the therapeutic process to try to have their own emotional needs met. So when in that kind of domain, or in that box where you're high on personal values and then low on professional obligations or professional ethics, that's usually the case when compassion overrides good judgment. So that's what I was saying about, they're such a nice person and they made a bad decision. They, put their money in the wrong stock, or they loaned their relative this money. And if they could just have $400, something like that. So that's usually the case. But I do talk about this in trainings where it's not always compassion that overrides good judgment. It's narcissistic needs that override good judgment. So, hey, I'm actually a little short on cash, and could you pay for like 4 sessions ahead of time? Or, hey, boy, my homeowner's insurance didn't cover my basement and it got flooded, and now I have a $10,000 bill that I have to pay. Can you pay for the next 2 months ahead of time? So that's when it starts becoming more pathological, in the sense that you're really trying to have your own needs met as opposed to being there for your patient.
Going back to those core ethical elements, and I don't have them memorized, so I don't have a paper in front of me, so I can't share them nearly as accurately as you, John. But I hear that that's where we see like the very clear violation and the compassion piece, a poor judgment. Like I hear that is that poor judgment and not really recognizing that, like, hey, great for the 400 now, but in the long term, what is that establishing? And best of intentions, but it really isn't in the client's best interest to just have their needs met in this way.
Right. And in the example that I'm giving you is, who would complain if you gave a patient $400 to make the rent? What are you doing in that office that your psychologist is giving you $400?
That's true. Yeah.
So that's who complains.
Right.
So whether it's a parent or a significant other, or, how did you get $400? Yeah. What are you doing? Wait, he's that nice of a person? You got to be kidding me. But then, and then the people who, again, it's the non-maleficence, this fidelity, non-maleficence, and justice. Those are the core basic principles that that psychologist would be potentially transgressing, because again, the harm being done to the patient in those cases, it could be that they're making the patient so dependent on them. You're not treating them fairly. Would you do that for every patient? I don't know about you two, but I couldn't write a check for all of my patients for $400. And how much of the person's agency are you taking away, against the dependency theme, by doing that, as opposed to problem solving with them? Okay, well, let's problem solve. Let's figure out, how is it that you can make next month's rent? Can you, talk to your landlord? Are there, other relatives you can ask for money? I mean, there's so many other options. That's why I give that as an example. It did happen somewhere in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but again, that's clearly, even though the person was acting beneficently, kind of missed the role and the therapeutic frame of what was going on.
John, as you've kind of been talking through this, and you made a comment just a little bit ago about, lack of training is, part of why we see some of these violations happening. But as you've been talking, and just being through many ethics courses over the years, I think a lot of times, again, we kind of focus on what are the ethical principles, and it's very factual, and point 3.01 says this and those things. And as I hear you talk, there's this blending. I mean, you've kind of used the word decision making a number of times, and decision science, I think you said, which sounds even better. I think that sounds really good, right? And then morality and this, personal values. So there's all these components that when we talk about ethics, I think a lot of times they get overlooked in trainings where, we're not always thought to be great critical thinkers about these things. So as you've been talking in my head, I'm going, this is really just being a good decision maker. So I guess what we're, knowing your website, and for those, who've not been on it, ethicalpsychology.com, you're always posting articles and there's a lot about the, ethical decision making. Can you kind of share a little bit about, what do you think the key components of that process are? So beyond knowing what the ethics codes are, what do you see as the key pieces to good ethical decision making? Well,
I'm going to tell you kind of a funny story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Right. I appreciate you plug in ethicalpsychology.com. And on the site, there are, I can't remember how many now, like 39 ethical dilemmas. And there are multiple graduate programs in psychology legit across the world that use these. They are not the typical, black letter law types of issues. So this is pre-COVID. I don't have long COVID, but my memory isn't as good as it was pre-COVID. But a state psychological association, who will remain unnamed, called me on the phone, and they were trying to get me to maybe come out and do a presentation. That's what I thought, So I get on the call and they're buttering me up and they're saying, wow, your site is great. Wow, the resources are fantastic. Oh, these dilemmas, they're wonderful. And oh, by the way, can we use the dilemma? I said, yeah, as long as you're not using them for your own training. I mean, if you're going to use them, pay me a little bit, just because I'm housing this. And so, but no, that's not what we want to do. So finally somebody said, well, I'm going to cut to the quick. Where are the answers? And I said, because I've done a podcast before. I said, did you go to podcast 3, 4, and 5? I think that'll help you understand what the answers are. Is that right? So there is no right answer to any of these questions. Right. So the idea behind the important things that you need to do is, I've already let the cat out of the bag, but I'll say it again to reinforce it. But we'll start with the SHAPE model, which is scrutinize. So you look at what the ethical dilemma is. So an ethical dilemma is actually when you have two competing ethical principles. And by the way, I do, I'm an evaluator for the American Board of Professional Psychology. And so they have to go through we review their clinical work and have to go through the ethical, and I've actually worked with some people to make sure that they do the ethics part correctly. But getting back to the point. So an ethical dilemma is when there are two competing ethical principles. So we'll go with the autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, fidelity, and justice. So, right. So is it, you're weighing the autonomy versus beneficence. So, just a real quick example. Somebody comes in for psychotherapy. They're not doing well in psychotherapy. You say, hey, I think you need to go for a medication evaluation. And then they say, no, I don't want to take medications. But clearly you see that they're not succeeding in psychotherapy. So do you do the autonomy piece and say, well, they're allowed to make the choice and not get medication, but you as the psychologist know that the combination of psychotherapy and medications actually help people get better. So do you push the beneficence or not? So that's kind of the anatomy of a true ethical dilemma when there are two competing ethical principles. That's the joke I kind of made earlier. So these black letter law ones, do I break the law? Do I not break the law? But that's not really an ethical dilemma. These types of things are the ethical dilemmas. So you scrutinize, you have to understand that, as you were talking about earlier, Paul, is that some people don't recognize there is an ethical dilemma. And that means that they haven't been trained well enough. So that's the first thing. So you scrutinize what are the competing ethical principles. Then you hypothesize what are some ways out of this. Then you analyze all of those. That's the A for, so scrutinize, hypothesize. A is analyze. P is perform. You go ahead and you do the intervention or you do whatever you think is correct. And then E is evaluate, you go back to that. So that's just a very simple, any kind of simple decision-making model you can do that with. But the core is that piece about what are the competing ethical principles. And then while you're doing the analysis piece before you perform, that's when you get consultation from other people, because I think that is absolutely key. We have to get outside of our own heads. We have to get feedback from other people. And I actually do consults for people. I do some consultation actually professionally where, I set up time with people and we do a half hour, 20 minutes or a half hour, and we go over a couple of cases and some ethical dilemmas. And so I'm actually that sounding board for some people. Now, PPA, Pennsylvania Psychological Association, has Dr. Molly Cowan. She took when Sam Knapp retired. So she does that for members. So I get people actually in Pennsylvania and outside of Pennsylvania who've listened to the podcast or who've gone to my website and they've signed up and asked and they said, hey, can we do some consultation? I say, absolutely. But part of that, and when I set people up to do a consultation with me, one of the things I say is you have to be brave enough to tell me what's really going on. Because if you're not being honest with me, I'm not going to be able to help you. So it's kind of like therapeutic to say that, is that we don't always make good decisions and we have to own up to that. And if you are in a hole, as we say to our patients in some other metaphor, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So that's part of being honest in a consultation is stop digging, get some help, and then hopefully you're going to minimize the harm that may have already occurred or mitigate any risk to you as a professional. So again, use that SHAPE model and then get consultation from other people, trusted colleagues, be honest about what's going on, and then be able to internalize that feedback, be able to accept that and say, yeah, I really messed up on this one. Yeah, here are the things that I really need to do to make this right. And you've got to be able to have the emotional intelligence and the emotional maturity to do that. So,
I think following that model, and just for the interest of time to kind of move in maybe the second part of our topic, one of the things in mental health in general is the landscape's ever changing. And one of the new changes to the landscape seems to be artificial intelligence and how that's coming into play. And, thinking about kind of this idea of an ethics model of decision making, I think it's important for people as they're trying to decide how they're going to use all of these technologies. So I know, I've noticed on your website, you've posted a few articles over the last, few weeks that are very AI driven. So can you share a little bit? What do you see as kind of implications of AI in mental health or psychology, at least from an ethical perspective?
Okay. So I'm going to take this in two parts.
Okay.
So I'm going to take the ethics part first, because that seems to be the easier one for me. So if you want to go to ethicalpsychology.com and you look at one of the dilemmas, so what you would do, because Ray, you're actually coming to my training in this fall, right?
I am, yes.
Spoiler alert, this is one of the things we're going to be doing. Okay. So you take the dilemma, you plug it into either Bard or ChatGPT, and then you hit go, and then you see what kicks out. And I've used ChatGPT to analyze some ethical dilemmas, and lo and behold, it's pretty good. I mean, occasionally there's something there. It's like, I'm not so sure, but that's what you can use it for. I will warn listeners, a lot of it is prompt driven. So you have to know the right prompts to put in. So if you say to ChatGPT, what are the ethical issues in this case? Then you plug the case in, or this scenario, and then it'll give you the ethical. Well, what are the legal, going back to what's the ethical, what's the legal, what's the clinical? What are the legal issues involved in this case? And then you spit it out and you can look at it. And it's the same thing. What are the clinical issues? So you can use ChatGPT to analyze ethical dilemmas. So my dilemmas are taken from real world experience that people have called me or called a trusted colleague, and then we got permission. We, jumbled it up a little bit. But these are like real world situations. So you get some very good Chat GPT, and then test that between, well, what did I think the issues are versus what does Chat GPT tell me? And can I kind of either meld those, or can I just use Chat GPT, or, oh boy, that was garbage, I feel uncomfortable with that, and then use my own stuff. So Chat GPT is using what we would call weak AI in terms of giving you what it knows based on reading a whole bunch of stuff, including ethics texts. So that's one way that Chat GPT can be used. Now, Kurt Gray, who is a psychologist, social psychologist, another shout out to social psychology at University of North Carolina, he and a group of people took, if I'm remembering the study correctly, took moral dilemmas, not really ethical dilemmas, took moral dilemmas and punched them in to an LLM like ChatGPT. I don't know if the LLM is large language model. So it was either BARD or ChatGPT or something like that. And then looked at whether the LLM could resolve the moral dilemma, and how does that compete with other human responses. And I can't remember, it was a really high correlation. I don't want to say it was like 90% correlated. So not just with looking at, again, N of one or two with me and maybe one other person did this. It looks pretty good for ethics. There's a larger study that looks at moral reasoning, and ChatGPT and the like can do that. Now, that's why I said that's the easier part, because it's a real simple tool that can help you. It enhances what you're doing in the profession, in the mental health profession. Now, what we also know about AI, and we're still in this weak AI stage. So weak AI means things like, Amazon giving you options. And if you're familiar with filter bubbles, again, this whole area is fascinating. So human beings are horrible decision makers, right? We all know that. So what originally happened was on the business side. So if you were going to go to a website and buy something, that company wanted to decrease the amount of time that you were spending on the website so that you would buy something. So what they did is they developed they called it a personalized algorithm or a filter bubble. That's what they were doing. They were filtering the information for you. So instead of looking at all automobiles, you would look at the, what do I drive? An Acura RDX. I don't have any stock in Acura, but okay, Acura RDX is for me. Boom, I bought it and I'm off the website. Good, I made a purchase. So that's how this originally started, trying to help people winnow down their decisions so that they could buy a product. So they started creating like an ethereal avatar of who you are somewhere out on the internet. So Amazon has an avatar of you, has an avatar of me. Netflix. So when you say recommended for you, this is weak AI. This is Netflix's AI making recommendations for you. So this is all kind of weak AI stuff. And even ChatGPT is weak AI. Even with weak AI, the research shows that most jobs can be done 30% faster, more efficiently. So then getting to psychology, well, how does that help us? What can we do to use AI? Well, the first thing that I thought of was when I do like my forensic work, I can use ChatGPT to help me research some ideas. And I'm not going to tell you the case I did, because I actually did it with a case. And it told me about a study, and I looked all over the internet for this study. This study did not exist. So ChatGPT makes errors. It recognizes it makes errors. Hilariously, I did this about a month ago, and yesterday on the news, the big story was this law firm put in a brief, and ChatGPT gave all of these bogus law cases. The judge sent it back and said, "Guys, we can't find this research. Show us the cases." So the guy went back to ChatGPT. Are these real cases? And ChatGPT said, of course they are. So then he resubmitted, and like the guy's up for he's in trouble now. So again, he's very low on personal ethics, low on professional obligations. Those are the people who get into trouble.
Right. So, it's interesting. I didn't realize that, you when you mentioned about putting in the ethical dilemmas, that it would kind of give you at least a process to think about, even though you have to double check it. It's kind of interesting that it does that.
Right. Well, let me interrupt you for just a moment. So the idea, though, is that, and that's where I was talking about, I took these dilemmas from real world experiences. So if you're going to use ChatGPT for your own ethical dilemma, you need to be able to be brutally honest with yourself. What are the ethical issues? Not that, I had this patient who was kind of grumpy, and then they said they were going to sue me. What are the ethical issues? And that's not, they're going to, it's going to say, I have no idea what your question means. So you have to be able to, and that's the beauty of the ethical dilemmas that I have on the website, is it gives sufficient detail, and it's fairly clear, again, with some training, what the, what's the ethical tension there. So that's the part. If you're going to use ChatGPT, it is at some level garbage in, garbage out, because it's weak AI. You have to be able to capture your ethical dilemma very well. Otherwise, you're not going to get a good response back. So the ethical dilemmas that I have on the website are ones that I've used, again, over 10 or 20 years, depending on when I published it. But I've used those, and I've gotten feedback and then fine-tuned them over time. So that's why they're really good. And this is why other graduate programs use it, because they're very, they've been massaged, they've been around for a while, they've been well used. So if you're going to use that, you have to be able to capture the real dilemma. And again, sometimes that's hard. Again, in terms of, we'll talk about decision science for a moment, the my side bias. If you're saying, I have a dilemma because my patient's grumpy, it's not going to work. You have to be able to say, here's what's going on in the situation. And then do you as a clinician have the insight to develop what the ethical dilemma is? If you're able to develop the ethical dilemma, then ChatGPT will work as a starting point, but it's not the end point.
And John, I wonder, like, when you're talking about this as a weak AI, the reliability of it. And so, if I think I have this term correct, the filter bubbles that you're talking about. And if ChatGPT has a filter bubble for you, it sounds like it's one that has a heavy focus on ethics. And I wonder, take someone who hasn't had that experience, or maybe they use ChatGPT for a very different feature or function. Do you feel like, does it give the same result?
ChatGPT is trained on a whole library of texts. It's not trained on you as a person. So it'll probably give you a comparable, maybe not exactly the same, but a comparable response. So
even if you utilize it, double checking the sources sounds like a really good,
absolutely.
Given your experience and then hearing about the attorney, what else? What else should people, that if they're using this, what are some things that they should be cautious about ethically, other than just double checking the sources? What's some other advice you would have? Well,
again, I don't know this to be true, but I'm going to say, I said the caveat first, and I'll give you the example. So I wrote an article, and Ray, I don't know if you read it. You at least had access to it. I don't know if you read it or not.
I have read it, yes.
But what I did with that is I put into ChatGPT, what are the ethical issues that psychologists need to be aware of when using ChatGPT? Provide an outline, and boom, it provided an outline. Then I took the outline and I went and I wrote it, and I pulled stuff off the ethics and psychology site, and then I made the article. And then the other beautiful part about ChatGPT is it proofreads. So I cut paragraph by paragraph. I put that into ChatGPT, and the prompt is, please check this for spelling, grammar, and what was the third thing I said? It was something like flow. It wasn't really flow, but it was readability. Check it for spelling, grammar, and readability. And then it edited paragraph by paragraph my article, and then I sent it out to people, and everyone's like, "Wow, that was so well written." The punchline is, well, ChatGPT helped me outline this and proofread the article. So yeah, but so I would not use it to cite sources. That's why I went out and I got the sources, and I integrated those sources into the text.
Yeah, and bringing that, one of the things, that article, I did get a chance to read it. I thought it was really interesting to see what it actually came up with. But, I think another ethical piece that was in there was the fact that you cited that you used ChatGPT, that it was part of the piece. And I wonder if, I guess I hear that from people who are teaching college, like this concern that people are going to have ChatGPT write papers and claim it as their own, versus people who embrace using it and acknowledge that they used it. I'm pretty new to ChatGPT, but I was just playing around with patient handouts and kind of put, what are good relaxation strategies? A little better wording that I put in there. But it came up with a really nice outline of some strategies that could be used, and in reviewing them, and I kind of went, wow, if I needed to come up with things to share with patients, that could be a great resource to use. But I think the important part is that we're acknowledging that that's how we're doing it. And I think, so when I read your article, was the first thing I noticed. I was like, oh, this is really, making sure that we're kind of saying, hey, ChatGPT was a co-author on it, or whatever we want to call them.
Right. So that is one of the concerns, is plagiarism, correct, and passing off GPT as your own work. The other thing that's going on with ChatGPT is, as they're calling it, jailbreaking it, so that people are taking ChatGPT, making it their own, basically, and then training it to do other things. So again, this goes back more, Paul, to your question was, hey, have you been trained? Are you training it? It's trained on you, right? Well, no, not really. But now people are doing that. They are taking ChatGPT and then giving it additional training on their own, so to speak, and doing other things with it, so that they're trying to move it from kind of a weak AI to a stronger AI for whatever their purpose is. So I'm not saying this drug company did this. This drug company has their own AI. But this was just in the news the other day that a drug company, I want to say it's in Canada, I could be wrong, but they found a new antibiotic for antibiotic resistant bacteria. So their AI went through all the literature, and they had access to more literature than ChatGPT, just trained it up real well. They went from, I think the article said 6,400 possibilities down to 270. And boy, isn't that an advantage? And then from that, they were able to do that. There's another company that has a new COVID-19 vaccine, also based on artificial intelligence. And this is we're still in that weak AI phase. And just to give your listeners and you both just the next two phases, the second phase is what's going to be called strong AI. And that's when AI is going to be acting more like a human being and can think and do meaning and have meaning at what it's doing. And then the third stage is super AI, which is it's above human consciousness. It's stuff we could never be able to do. And this is where we start getting into super intelligence, Skynet, and all of the literature on, what could go wrong and how it poses an existential threat to humanity. Potentially.
Right. Yeah. And I know we've, talked about ChatGPT, but, some of the articles I've seen is, they're also using it to help clarify diagnosis. And I don't think necessarily ChatGPT, but some forms of AI. I don't know if maybe you have more knowledge on this, but it seems that they're at least as accurate as we are as humans in looking at symptoms and diagnosis, and maybe better, that there's maybe a little higher accuracy. Is that what you're seeing in what you're reading as well?
Yeah, and I hope we're able to apply this to psychology, because this is going to be part of my presentation in the fall. But if you look at what the medical research is doing now, they are doing wonderful things. So they're training. They have AI that they're training on. I'm going to say this wrong, but breast imaging. I don't know exactly what that's called. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But their AI can detect breast cancer before the physician can detect it. And they're not sure how that can happen. But that's pretty freaky stuff. They're also
by reading a scan.
Well, it's trained on, here are all these healthy breasts. And and then here are the ones that, over time it gets worse, and then it turns into cancer. So, and that's what it's training it on. And it now, there is a program out there that can do it better. If you think about even the Da Vinci, which is not really AI, but it kind of is AI, the Da Vinci that they use for surgeries, that again, it helps surgeons perform better surgeries. So then how does this then translate into psychology? We don't yet know. We do know that there are some virtual reality interventions for things like agoraphobia, for PTSD, very expensive at this point. Again, the efficacy is good, but it's too expensive. Is there some way that we can decrease that? There's been some studies on voice patterns and suicidality. So wouldn't that be cool if you had like a little earplug while you're talking to your patient, and then the AI says, ask about suicidality, or your patient isn't being honest with you, or ask them about their mother. Or something like that.
Right.
Or is there, again, this is just all the weird stuff I think about. Right. You understand why I started thinking about consciousness when I was like 16 years old. So, if you had Google glasses, and the Google glasses were, because you're looking at your patient and it's able to pick up these very subtle cues from your patient and then informs you what those subtle cues mean. So again, this is the death of poker playing, because isn't that what poker's about? Is about reading those subtle cues. So if you have Google glasses that help you read cues, but can you use that beneficently? Can you use that to actually help your patient? Imagine if there's a smell. Is there a smell that helps people become more open to suggestions? I don't know the answer to any of these. The last one I'm going to give you, and Ray, I'm giving you all the spoiler alerts, so sorry, you're going to be doing my presentation. Going back to the consciousness thing, we know that consciousness is a field, right? So it's an electromagnetic field around your head. It's not inside your skull. It's like outside your skull. We're on the same page, at least. Electroencephalograph, you got that, basically? Right. Okay.
Yep.
What if you had a tool that you would put under your patient's seat? And what it would do is it would read their electromagnetic activity and then calm it down or focus it to be more attentive to you. Again, will this ever come to be? I don't know. But what we do know is, like I said, AI helps people do their jobs 30% more efficiently, and that's even without training. So if we could get that and help people with mental health issues, and we can get them, and again, please, I know I'm more of a cognitive behaviorist, but if we could get them out in like 8 sessions and they're functioning at a much higher level, wouldn't that be great than seeing them for like 2 years? And I think the answer to that, to me, values-based, is yes, that would be fantastic.
And John, I guess I keep coming back to the dual model, and each time I do, I think I'm getting more and more, having a better understanding of it. But when you're talking about developing this smarter AI stronger AI, and the different potential applications that it has, I hear that we can program and we can train really, really well for the professional obligation element of that, like the letter, those pieces. And how challenging do you think it is, or it would be, to train it for the personal values? And how do we distill down personal values? And I guess trying to make it no longer personal, but identifying those values and, really trying to capture them and giving them and training them with an AI. So that way, when we're, maybe asking an AI to help us write a treatment plan or helping to give a direction and, what is the best course here, that it's doing so, ethically in a sense. Like, how challenging do you think that is?
So are you going to have me back for another episode?
We're going to have to.
It sounds like
because probably by next week, this is all going to be updated with something new coming out.
Too. But I'm going to do this really quickly. So again, I apologize to the listeners, but right. So moral foundations theory, it has different categories, much like autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, fidelity, and justice. And I actually wrote a paper on this. I never published it. I wrote it during COVID. It just got away from me. But the moral foundations actually overlay those basic ethical principles fairly well. So then the question is, when you say, hey, how do we help people train morally for going into psychology? Because there's at least 5 foundations. Which do you put first? So there has been research that American psychologists put autonomy, as I mentioned this earlier, as the number one ethical guiding principle. We have to use that first. Oddly enough, in Canada, beneficence is the number one ethical principle that they look at. So which one are you going to train on? So is it going to be autonomy? Is it going to be beneficence? So in the moral foundations theory, it's care versus harm. Again, we don't want to harm anybody, but it's care, fairness, right? Purity. So there's different moral foundations that you can look at. So what do you train on? And I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is there's certain things we know about human existence. And again, sorry, you can have me back about this one too. But we know human beings are meaning makers. That's where the philosophy comes in. People are pattern repeaters, right? This is what we do. We repeat patterns. That's where my cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. And we are super cooperators. Human beings, we would not exist in the society that we live in if we were not super cooperators. And morality is the glue to our cooperation. So, so again, if it were me and I were saying I am, the president of morality in the United States, I would train people on beneficence and cooperation because that's how we got here. But that might not be everybody else's value. And again, that's when you go through some of these ethical dilemmas. And what I choose might be right for me ethically. Paul, what you choose might be different. It might be completely ethical and just different for you. And Ray, you could choose even a different path that could also be ethically correct and morally consistent with you. So again, you can have, and this goes back to what I was joking around with the State Psychological Association called me. I went through the whole riff, but that's the idea, is that you just want to make sure you're doing the best for your patient that's consistent with your values. And if you're doing that, then you're good. But you might not be, again, might be based on your age, might be based on sexual orientation. It might be based on your clinical preference. Are you a CBT? Are you psychodynamic? Are you trans-theoretical? Again, it just depends. So
I agree. I think we are going to have you come back, because I think this could be, I actually, as you were talking, I'm thinking, how are you going to do this in this workshop in the fall? Because it could just kind of go in so many different directions.
As you know, I do things, you may not know, I do things way ahead of time. So the presentation's already done. I already sent it to people and asked them for feedback. So it's already, I will make adjustments, but it's pretty much already done.
That's great. So, John, just to kind of wrap up a little bit, we like to kind of end the show with kind of getting some takeaways from our guests. And, listening to all the things you're kind of involved in, I guess, what keeps you kind of psyched to continue to do what you do and to attack ethics and AI and all of these things?
Again, I'm going to say what I just said, beneficence. So I want to make the world a better place. I am a super cooperator by coming on your show. You can see that. And by volunteering a lot of time for the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, I'm a super cooperator. So that's what keeps me going. I really try to, I'm grateful for all of the luck that I have had. I mean, I've worked hard, but I also recognize I've been very, very lucky. And that's what keeps me going.
Awesome. If you could recommend a book, can be any book you want, for people in the profession to read, what's something you'd suggest?
Well, one of the things that I did, and I didn't go over this, but when I was a graduate, or not a graduate, was an undergraduate student at Penn State, I like to read a lot, and I read more probably Stephen King than anybody else, but I'm going to recommend Stranger in a Strange Land. I read that when I was a sophomore in college. And then when I taught psychology, I used that because there are so many psychological principles in that. So if you, the outline, the general outline of the story is a child was born on Mars, was raised by Martians for a little bit, and then came back to Earth and then has to learn about earthly ways. And he's got some superpowers, we'll say that. And, but there's developmental models, there's things about language, there's things about ethics, there's things about morality, all kind of good stuff. So I think Robert Heinlein, was a psychologist, and he did not even know it. In terms of a professional book, I would recommend, what's it called? Practical Ethics for Psychologists. And that's by Lee Vandekreek and Sam Knapp. And I think the acculturation model is actually referenced in that book as well. But it's more of a positive approach to ethics.
Awesome. Very good. And kind of last question we have, with all of the experiences you had, if you could provide our listeners or new clinicians kind of maybe 3 gems or takeaways that you've learned in your career that you think could be of value to them, what would they be?
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record. So number 1 is patience. So in terms of decision science, what we know is that don't make any decisions rapidly. So what you have to do is be patient. Be patient with your patients. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with your decision making. So that's number 1. Unless it's an emergency, of course, and then you've got to hurry up and make a decision. But other than that, be patient. You got time. The second thing is something we didn't talk about. I was hoping we were talking about, but ethical dilemmas don't always have to be gut-wrenching issues. So you can be engaged in ethical work and being mindful of your own self in your average everyday existence. So an example that I give in my trainings is that if you're sitting across from somebody and they tell you that they took a mental health day and they lied to their boss in order to take a mental health day, and you sit across from them and you're doing this, and the audience can't see it, but you're just shaking your head, yes, and you let them go on, what does that say about your practice? Is that that's a choice point. So are you going to say, I'm confused. You said you lied to your boss about taking a mental health day. Can you explain that to me a little bit more? Because looking at, so again, that's not a gut wrenching. That's not like, oh my God, somebody's going to take my license away. Oh my God. It's how you're doing therapy. So in your average everyday existence, you are having ethical issues that come up every day. There's something going on ethically, not a gut wrenching, not a revocation, but that's important to be reflective. And then the final thing, the third gem, is humility. Because again, what I've known, the famous story that I tell people, I worked with this guy, I swear, for at least 2 years. And he was a super depressed guy. He had worked for the Commonwealth. And I was really, there with him. And sometimes I saw him twice a week. And he was just so down and so dire, and, just like every other week wanted to die by suicide, and his life was horrific. And I was just, again, I was being patient, okay, meeting him where he's at. So he comes in one day and he goes, man, I feel better. And immediately my thought was, very narcissistically, wow, all of this paid off. Something happened and we're having a breakthrough. An aunt that I knew, I had no idea. She was a multimillionaire. She had no kids. She left me $1.3 million after taxes. So I appreciate everything that you've done for me. You've been such a help, but I don't think I need to come back. So you got to have some humility. There's so much stuff that goes on in the hours outside of your office that you have no control over. So no matter how hard of the work you do, something may happen out in the world that helps your patient well beyond your control.
That's great. So John, thank you so much for joining us. And definitely we would love to have you come back. And, I think with ethics, I think this is just such a topic that you could just go on and go in so many different directions. So would love to have you come back, but thank you for taking an evening and chatting with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me. It was wonderful.
Absolutely.
We hope this episode got you psyched, and we want to thank you all for listening. And definitely want to extend that big thank you to Dr. John Gavazzi for joining us on today's episode and really talking to us both about ethics education as well as how AI impacts mental health. John, if our listeners are interested in learning more, where can they follow you or hear more about what you're doing? Go
to www.ethicalpsychology.com. You can sign up for the daily post. I'm on Twitter at Dr._Gavazzi. I'm on LinkedIn. You could just go to John Gavazzi, and I'm actually on Spoutable now. So that's the new social media site that's trying to compete with Twitter.
I don't know that I'm familiar with that, but I'll have to check it out and
learn something new.
I hope our listeners check it out as well. And if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on to Psyched to Practice, you can visit our website at www.psychedtopractice.com, or certainly following us on all major social media by searching Psyched to Practice. If you enjoyed this episode, it would really mean so much for us if you would review the podcast on Apple Music or Spotify, as well as just sharing the podcast with anyone you know that's interested in psychology or mental health. Until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.